Why Fiat failed in America. Imagine a car brand that failed in the United States, made a comeback decades later with a new strategy and capital from bailing out one of America's largest automakers, only to end up failing again for a second time. This is the story of Fiat in the United States. Not just one failure, but two separate failures, decades apart. And interestingly, the same brand remained thriving in its home market in Europe the entire time. In this video, we're tracing both chapters of Fiat's failure in America and why a brand so successful on one side of the Atlantic kept struggling to survive on the other. Fiat's history in America actually began far earlier than many people might assume, dating back to 1908. This Italian automaker even operated a manufacturing plant in Poughkeepsie, New York, before eventually closing that plant in 1917 after the United States entered World War I. This is a fairly interesting, often forgotten fact. Fiat's relationship with the American market has actually spanned more than a century, far longer than many people assume, given that many only know Fiat as a European brand newly entering the American market. Fiat then returned to America, and after reaching a peak of more than 100,000 vehicles sold in 1975, their sales collapsed dramatically throughout the early 1980s. This collapse ultimately forced Fiat to withdraw entirely from the United States in 1983, after their reputation was severely damaged by persistent reliability issues. This was Fiat's first failure in America, a chapter that ended fairly bitterly and should have served as a valuable lesson for their return in the future. Fiat's path back to America actually ran through a major crisis moment for one of America's largest automakers, Chrysler's bankruptcy in 2009. This Italian company bought a stake in the struggling automaker, with Fiat's CEO at the time, Sergio Marchionne, making a big bet that American demand for small European cars, like the success he'd witnessed with Mini, could be replicated through a relaunched Fiat 500. This was a fairly reasonable bet on paper. Mini had indeed proven there was a market for small, European-style cars in America. The question was whether the Fiat 500 could replicate similar success, given their own history of failure in this market decades earlier. A year into the relaunch, Marchionne himself admitted that their marketing strategy had turned out to be too naive. He reflected with remarkable honesty. They thought they could just show up in the market, and simply because people liked gelato and pasta, people would automatically buy their product, an assumption he himself called nonsense. This is an admission we rarely hear directly from a CEO, a fairly surprising piece of honesty about just how shallow their initial assumptions were about what actually drives American consumers' purchasing decisions. Associating a car product with a pleasant Italian cultural image turned out to be far from enough to genuinely convince consumers to buy. Despite this shaky start, Fiat's sales actually did climb, reaching a peak of 46,121 vehicles 2 years after launch. But even the addition of the more practical 500L model, a people mover launched a year later, couldn't stop demand from beginning to gradually decline. This is a fairly common pattern in automotive product cycles. A promising initial momentum, followed by a slow but steady decline as the initial appeal fades and underlying problems begin to show. This 500L model quickly flopped due to a combination of several problems: transmission reliability issues, a lack of real marketing muscle, and a fairly quirky European styling that many North American buyers simply couldn't warm up to. Just imagine this combination of problems from a consumer's perspective. A car with recurring mechanical issues, marketed fairly weakly, with a design that felt foreign to typical American automotive taste. This is a combination that's difficult to overcome, regardless of how good the car's underlying concept actually was. But the bigger story was actually structural. Sales of new cars under $20,000 fell a staggering 75% industry-wide, as persistently cheap gasoline and a strong economy sent American consumers rushing back to big trucks and SUVs. This was a shift away from hatchbacks, a trend that hit Fiat's entire lineup at exactly the wrong time. Just imagine this situation. Fiat had just rebuilt their presence in America based on small, efficient cars, right at the moment when broader American consumer preference was moving in a completely opposite direction. This is an important reminder that sometimes a brand can do everything reasonably well on the product side, but still lose against a much larger market preference shift that's entirely outside their control. By 2018, Fiat brand sales had cratered to just 15,521 vehicles, a 41% single-year drop and the lowest level since the brand's American relaunch. The once popular 500 had dwindled to barely over 5,000 units sold that year. Just imagine the scale of this decline, from a car that had once been the symbol of Fiat's American comeback, down to just a small fraction of their peak sales only a few years earlier. In 2019, Fiat Chrysler quietly pulled the 500, along with its Abarth and 500e variants, entirely from their North American lineup. This was followed by the discontinuation of the 500L in 2020, leaving only the 500X and the 124 Spider convertible still on sale. Notice how this was carried out, not with a major announcement of brand failure, but by quietly pulling models one by one. This is a fairly clear sign that the company had already recognized the direction things were heading long before they officially acknowledged it. This collapse then accelerated rapidly. Fiat's U.S. sales fell 69.3% in 2020 amid the pandemic, then fell again by another 83.5% in 2021 as the semiconductor chip shortage hit the global automotive industry. By 2022, Fiat sold just 160 vehicles across the entire United States, a number that effectively marked the brand's exit from the American market for a second time. Just imagine the scale of this decline, from a peak of more than 46,000 units down to just 160 units in under a decade. What's fairly ironic about this entire story is that this failure was genuinely unique to America. Across the Atlantic, Fiat remained a genuinely successful brand, with their small cars still well suited to European roads and buyer preferences. This once again proves a principle we've seen repeated many times before. A brand built for one particular market rarely survives being dropped, unchanged, into a market with very different characteristics. Fiat didn't fail because their cars were inherently bad. The very same cars succeeded massively in Europe. They failed because they assumed a formula that worked in their home market could be applied directly to America, without genuinely accounting for different consumer preferences, market trends moving in the opposite direction, and the need to genuinely adapt their product to local conditions, rather than simply relying on a pleasant cultural image alone. If you enjoy global automotive business case studies like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss other case studies on global business successes and failures. See you in the next video.